Hi and welcome to this MRDCL Fundamentals video in which we look at exporting data from MRDCL. You'll find the files used in this video in the folder DAT08. Alright, so we're going to use actually the project used in the DAT07 video and use that as a file to export to other software and look at what you can do. Alright, so I'm going to start by just saying here's a script that has a data stage to it. It's got various variables in there and it's got some tables in there. Now, one thing that's important to understand when you're exporting from MRDCL is what's exported is the variables, or are the variables that are sitting on the IDF. Now, you may remember from other videos that the IDF is a file that's generated when you run MRDCL. So let's just have a look at that running and just see what that looks like to remind ourselves. So if I run this and we look at the log here, you'll see that this particular project had 2 records and there were 2 records on the IDF. If I'd have put any checks in there that rejected any records or made some care as to what records I wrote away, that could be less than 2, it could be 1, or if it's a sample of 500, it could be 485 or something like that. So what you're exporting is what's on the IDF. And that applies both to the records that are sitting there and, of course, to any variables that you define. Now, one important thing to note is that you are allowed in MRDCL to put variables in the table stage or even redefine variables. They will not be available for export because the export works on the IDF and it's effectively too late in the process. So if I was to define a variable in here called age2 and it was grouping age together as 1 to 2 and 3 and had some labels in it and so on, that would be excluded from our run when we export it. It would work as far as a variable for doing tables, but it would be after the finished data and wouldn't be available in a run. And similarly, if you did any fixing in the table stages, so for example, if we said something like, if the serial number is 2, make gender 2. So we're switching serial number 2 to take the value 2 for gender. Again, that would be too late because the IDF is written at the finished data point, or if there's a write statement when there's a write statement. So those 2 important considerations to bear in mind. Otherwise, we can now look at running this and looking at what happens when we export. You obviously have to compile and execute, otherwise the IDF won't be built with the latest variables and records. And then we can click on the export menu and we get a choice of options that we can choose. So let's go through what these all are. The first on the list is Reflect, and that's the free secondary analysis software that you're allowed to use, which allows you to do tables on projects already processed in MRDCL. So Reflect files mean that you can distribute a project to colleagues or to clients free of charge. They just need to install the free Reflect software to be able to do that. Then we've got QPSMR. That's another system that we provide as well, and QPSMR allows you to export the project to QPSMR, so you can use it within that. SSS is another export that is supported by about 50 different market research software packages around the world. It's a universal standard that's been agreed for transporting both the data and the text specifications and the variable definitions from one piece of software to another. And what it'll produce is an XML file containing all those texts and definitions and an ASCII file that will hold the data. So that's a SSS file. If you want to know more about SSS, there's a website called www.triple-s.org where you can find out even more details of that and find out which software suppliers support that. So it's a good way for porting a project from one system to another. TSXE is very similar. It's a slightly extended version of SSS that contains a few more controls, so that if you wanted to build something on the top of SSS, perhaps to automate another system or move a project into another piece of software, you could do that. SPSS is a proprietary piece of software that is commonly used around the world, mainly for statistical analysis. So if you want to export an MRDCL project from into SPSS, you could just choose that option, and you'll see that although SPSS actually only says 12 to 16 here, SPSS hasn't changed its file layout for quite some time. Only the really old versions, 10, 11, 8 and 9 were different. So you can just choose that export and it will work fine. SAS is a bit like SPSS. It's another statistical program that's found, and you can export to that using that option. If you want to export to Quantum, that's another tabulation piece of software. There's a checkbox so that you can choose that export, and that will export the project to Quantum. And then the last three on the list do not produce quite the same export as the ones above. The ones at the bottom there, the last three, what they produce is an export that will just produce the data with a map, but it won't convert or move all of the text so that they can be used instantly in another piece of software. So someone would have to probably re-enter the specifications or find some way to get the texts in that describe the data. So that's a slightly different. So one of them is comma separated. One of them is fixed format ASCII, so you'll get an ASCII record out, and another one is using a fairly rarely used and dated format for 80-column ASCII that has been used more frequently in the past. When you choose these options, you'll see that certain fields are allowed to be checked over here. So one of those, for example, is spread field to multi-code. Spread field is a very efficient way of moving big multi-variables from one piece of software to another. One of the problems you can have with a multiple variable, and this is true of SPSS as well, is that they can, if they're exported as being true and false, i.e. a 1 for true and as 0 for false, or a blank for false, and the variable happens to contain maybe 1,000 brands or something like that, that record will have 1,000 fields saying whether each code or bit in that variable is true or false. So it's a fairly inefficient way, and programs like SPS only don't support multi-coded variables as one entity as they are supported in MRDCL. So this is a way of getting around that to some extent, that a spread field will allow you to store the values for as many fields as there are. So say there's 1,000 brands in a question, and the most responses that any respondent picks is 5, and a particular respondent had 1, 5 and 28 picked, it would store 1 in the first field, 5 in the second and 28 in the third, and leave the fourth and fifth ones blank to accommodate that maximum that's found in the data. So the data's not in fixed fields, it's stored over a range of columns, and that's called a spread field format, and can make projects with a high density of multi-coding stored in a much more efficient way. So let's pick SSS as we're on that one and run an export, and it's by default choosing run sss.asc as the output name. That looks like a perfectly good name to me, and it's produced that for me. And if I look in the folder that I was working, you can now see I've got an XML file and an ASCII file. The ASCII file will contain the data, and the XML file, if we quickly open that, will see a representation of all the variables and all the texts in my project. And that then can be read in by any product that can import a SSS file. As I say, there's a significant number now that can do that for you. So that's looking at how we do exports. Now we can go some steps further than that. That export I just ran there just basically listed or exported every single variable that we had. Now there are times when you want a bit more control than that, so you have this option to produce a DTV file, which is a directory of all the variables. So let's make a DTV file and let's see how that works. So let's make a DTV file. I'm going to call this my export. Click OK and save it. And now if we go back to the folder I was working in, you can see I've got my export.dtv. I can open that in an editor of my choice, so I'm going to choose this editor. And you'll see down the left hand side I've got a list of variables. Across here I can now see what type of variable they are, how many codes they got if they have responses, a repeat of the codes, and this would tell you the layout if you were producing an ASCII file so that you have a sort of map of where the data is. Now, having got these variables, I can then manipulate them. So if, for example, when I'm exporting, I don't want this particular variable I'm highlighting now, I could just delete that. So I can just delete that one, and that wouldn't be exported. And then maybe I want gender and age as the first variables in my output file, so I can just move them up to the top. And now when I export and I ask it to read this DTV file, it will export them in this order, but only the variables that I have selected. So let's now save that. Let's go back to my project. Let's export it. Let's pick SSS again. Select my DTV file, which was my export.dtv. Click OK. Click OK again. Overwrite the export I did before. And let's just go into have a look at what we've got now in the XML file. So let's open the XML file again. And you'll see now that at the top here, we've got gender and age coming out as the second and third variables, and the variable I deleted will have disappeared. So that's not been part of the export. So this is a way of controlling your exports, and it's very useful this when you're running perhaps a project every month, or it might be rerun because there's errors. You haven't got to do all that moving of variables a second time or keep repeating your work. You can just pick up the DTV file, run it again, and your export will be as it was before in terms of the variables you've selected and in terms of order. Now, the other type of export that you've got, which is not strictly an export but is sometimes used by people, is a list type statement, and it's not really an export. It's actually just running a command in MRDCL, but some people think of it as an export. And this command here, list CSV, this tells it to list out some of the variables that we want. Now, I added some options here that you can use or not use as you choose. If you put bracket H bracket after the CSV, it will tell MRDCL to list it out with a heading so that each of the columns in the CSV file that it's going to produce have the heading of the variable name for reference. And the other thing that might look a bit strange here is that rather than listing $gender, I put an ampersand on the front of that, and what that will do, rather than listing the code for gender, so rather than outputting a 1 or a 2, it'll actually output the text for gender, so that I'm going to get a spreadsheet now which will contain IELTS, which is the serial number, the text for gender, the text for age, and the text for question 1. And I've already run this, so I can just now go and have a look at the file it's produced. We'll find there's a file called runreport.csv, so we can just open that up. Comes out the CSV file. And here's my 2 records listed out. There's my heading coming out because I asked it to put a header out. If I hadn't have put that bracket H bracket, it wouldn't have put that out. And here it's listed the serial number, the text for the gender, the text for the age, and the text for Q1. And this is quite a nice tool that you can use either to provide parts of the data to clients, or sometimes I've used it for checking tables where figures perhaps look suspicious. You can just put it into a spreadsheet where you can then start to do sorting or sums and use all the other tools that Excel offers you for manipulating data. So that completes this video on exporting data from MRDCL, and there's obviously more videos in this series to help you get started with MRDCL. Thank you.